French President Emmanuel Macron has made recent global headlines based on a statement he made at a press interview at a conference. This statement included, "We should not exclude that there might be a need for security that then justifies some elements of deployment. But I've told you very clearly what France maintains as its position, which is a strategic ambiguity that I stand by." This has led many people to believe that Macron intended to send NATO troops to send French troops into Ukraine to combat the Russians. However, was this actually what he meant? Are we likely to see NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine anytime soon? Well, I'll go into that a little bit in this video. Now, this conference at which Macron was speaking to the press was held in aid of Ukraine and how Western nations could better help Ukraine fight against the Russians. As the war is now in its second year, the Ukrainians have been on the back foot since the failure of the 2023 summer campaign, the counter-offensive to make any significant gains whatsoever. Ukraine was further on the back foot and lost the strategic town of Avdiivka, which had been fought over since the start of the conflict, to Russian forces earlier this year. It was in light of these battlefield setbacks that President Macron and indeed the conference in general were speaking about ways in which to aid Ukraine to continue fighting against the Russians on the battlefield when the issue of deployment was mentioned. However, Macron's NATO allies were very against the idea, several of them coming out very quickly to dismiss any idea that there would be a deployment of NATO forces in Ukraine at all. One of the first was the United States, which unequivocally said that this would not happen. They were followed by several others who said that they certainly would not be committing any soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. These include the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, and Czechia as well. So it's clear then that most of these NATO countries are not after sending ground troops to physically fight against the Russians in Ukraine. So that's the end of the story. Well, perhaps it isn't. This wasn't actually the first time that this was suggested. Much earlier in the conflict, the Polish Prime Minister Andrzej Duda also suggested that NATO troops could be involved inside the country itself, though the actual role they would play is somewhat unclear. Now, the main reason, of course, why this is an issue is because if NATO countries send their soldiers to fight against the Russians, then the Russians would clearly see this as an escalation. And indeed, in this case, again, the Russian Kremlin spokesperson has also responded to the comments made by Macron and the suggestion of NATO military deployment. Dmitry Peskov said, "In that case, we would need to talk not about the probability, but about the inevitability of direct conflict. Given that both several NATO countries and indeed Russia are nuclear-armed powers, let alone powers with very large conventional armories and arsenals, this is a very worrying prospect. If there would be a larger conflict between these states, I hardly need to say, and so this is something that NATO would like to avoid at all costs." However, there may be more to this story. And that is that actually NATO is already involved in many ways, giving many arms and indeed training to Ukrainian soldiers. The difference is that the training takes part, for the most part, in Poland, the neighboring country to Ukraine, rather than in Ukraine itself. However, it has been suggested that perhaps that training could also take place in Ukraine rather than in Poland, with members of NATO military forces perhaps becoming responsible for the demining of areas away from the front line, which then shouldn't be seen as a provocation and leading to direct conflict with Russia. However, some have also argued that it may be possible to have different kinds of NATO military personnel on the ground, rather than having actual fighting against the Russians with conventional military forces. Macron, in a statement to elucidate what he meant at the conference, has said that this could take shape in, for example, demining operations, so getting rid of landmines, but critically also in cybersecurity, something that has been very important in this war so far, as well as in the production of munitions and arms inside Ukraine rather than inside NATO countries and then being shipped to Ukraine, which Recently, Volodymyr Zelensky has said that only around a third of the ammunition, the artillery shells promised by the European Union have actually made it to Ukraine. Perhaps then there is scope for a more limited NATO military intervention in terms of non-combat personnel aiding the Ukrainian armed forces behind the lines. Although it should be noted this is already happening, just not as much inside Ukraine itself, but rather from the NATO countries, so especially from Poland, as well as training taking place in other countries. However, an escalation at this point with more direct involvement by NATO forces, which perhaps is what Macron was alluding to, has been shot down quite a lot by various NATO spokespeople, including Jens Stoltenberg and various other national leaders since Macron has made his statement. So, for example, Olaf Scholz, who is the Chancellor of Germany, has said what was agreed among ourselves and with each other from the very beginning also applies to the future, namely that there will be no ground troops, no soldiers on Ukrainian soil sent there by European countries or NATO states. So with statements like these and the US already saying that they certainly will not be sending troops into Ukraine, it seems very unlikely that a NATO country will independently choose to do so, which is of course within their remit. As long as NATO as a whole is not involved, any one country can decide to send troops if it wishes, but it seems that at this current stage that is unlikely. Whether this remains the same in the future is a little bit of a question, as some of the red lines that had been drawn by NATO, for example, about tanks or about sending certain other types of weapons, and now about the F-16 jets, have been crossed in the past. So perhaps, depending on how the situation goes on the battlefield, this one will be too, although that seems rather unlikely as things stand. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching this video. I thought I'd do a little update about what was happening in Ukraine and with this most recent statement, as this is something that a lot of people find interesting to watch. I thought I'd go back and make this video. I hope you have enjoyed watching this video and that you will check out some of the other videos that I've been uploading recently on the channel. I've got a whole host of videos that I'd like to produce in the future. Some things coming on various languages, including on Frisian. We've got videos coming on flags as well. Other talks from the conference, the student conference that I co-host in Oslo, will also be making it to the channel, as well as some miscellaneous things, a few new unannounced series to come. So lots of exciting things to be seen on the channel in the future. So we'd be much obliged if you did subscribe, give me a thumbs up, and I will see you in the next one.